Welcome to Productive Joy with Dr. Christie, where fun meets action.
Hi, friends. Welcome to Productive Joy. I am telling you, I have such the honor today of interviewing a new friend. Her name is Janice Kaplan. But before we get into Janice's story and learn a little bit more about her, I really want you to start subscribing to this podcast because you won't get notified that these brilliant people are on here and changing lives if you don't follow us. So make sure you're following and look for your shot of B12. It's free, y'all, and it is definitely worth it. So today is definitely no exception to the rule. Today is going to be a special day. Today we have with us Miss Janice Kaplan. Janice, welcome to Productive Joy.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I know. I need to tell you a little bit about Janice. So Janice is an author of 15 books. She used to be the editor-in-chief of Parade magazine. You might have heard of it. She's a mom of 2 sons. She is a wife. She's a swimmer. She's a New Yorker, like actually lives in an apartment in New York, which I think is cool. That to me screams New Yorker. But she also has a country home. She has hiked the Alps more than once and is a world traveler. And she's a guest today on Productive Joy. So Janice, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so I am super excited to learn more about you because as I did some digging, I found that you have lived a pretty fascinating life. And what I love the most is that you're choosing to share all of the lessons you've learned with others through all of your books, which is very cool. But here's what I've learned about people. People are funny and they don't listen for very long until they decide they want to. So in 30 seconds or so, can you convince people that this is a podcast they can't miss?
Well, sure. My whole approach in the last few years, in the last few books that I've done, is to try to have people have more happiness, joy, and gratitude in their lives. And when I wrote the Gratitude Diaries a few years ago, I did that by living more gratefully. And when I wrote this book, I discovered something completely new and different about happiness, which doesn't get talked about very much or at all, which is really that it's not our big, smart brains that make us happy, but sometimes it's our bodies. And so that has been the great breakthrough for me.
Oh my gosh, what an awesome way to think about things. And I couldn't agree more. I know when I don't feel well, I don't respond well, right? Like I just don't have that same positivity that I tend to try to have at all times. I have always been one that has looked for the good in things, but that doesn't mean that I always find it, right? Sometimes it's kind of hard. So you have written quite a few books, and I'm just curious before we jump into your latest, you had that many in you. How did you get them out, right? So I think so many people have books in them and don't realize how to get them out. How did you get them out?
I always loved writing, and I actually published my first book the year I graduated college. It was called Women in Sports. And I've been a journalist, I've been a writer, I've been a TV producer, and I have a lot of different interests. And so the joy of writing is that I get to explore something in great depth. I get to talk to really smart people, interview really smart people, and then write it and try to share what I've learned. I've also written lots of novels, and those for me are just kind of fun. I always find my agent teases me that, that I'm the only person who thinks it's fun to write a novel, but I just find I don't have to do any research when I do those. I get to make stuff up. And certainly when I'm writing nonfiction, I'm not making anything up. I'm looking for really helpful advice that people can have.
Well, and just even from looking at your table of contents, it is so exciting. So let's dig in a little bit because I think that if ever there was a perfect match between productive joy and a book, it is yours. So the title of your book, I have to look, What Your Body Knows About Happiness, How to Use Your Body to Change Your Mind. And I love every chapter is really about being happy, joyful, finding yourself. But the ones that kind of stood out to me, and I'll let you go in whatever direction makes sense to you. Colors. You mentioned colors, blue and green specifically. You mentioned Apple Watches. You mentioned a happy body food plan that I thought was pretty cool. And then really just how it all fits together, exercise, sex, all the stuff, right? So what direction would you like to take us today?
Well, let's start with the basics. First of all, you're wearing a very pretty purple sweater, so that is bright and cheerful and adding to everybody who gets to see it. And that in itself is important. And part of the reasons it's important is because we take in the things that we see, that we touch, that we smell, that we feel. And, I said we think of our brains as being the one in charge of everything. Your brain is sitting there in a very dark skull. Your
Mm.
brain isn't doing anything on its own. It's only taking the input that you get from the outside or that it gets from your body. And, you said just before that there are times that you don't feel as joyful as you would like. Well, of course, we all feel that way. And let me tell you, Christy, how I started this book, which is that because I wrote the gratitude diaries, I know all the gratitude tricks. And there I was on a vacation. I was heading out on a vacation. And you know how it is when you have one of those awful travel days when everything seems to go wrong. And I'm standing in this very small airport where we had landed, and I'm just feeling tenser and tenser. And my husband, often teases me and he goes, "Hey, Ms. Gratitude, not allowed to do that." So I decided to try all my little gratitude tricks, reframing situations, thinking positively. So I go, "Okay, I don't care that our luggage is lost because I have a swimsuit in my carry-on." And I'm trying all these other little things and we're laughing. And then cut to a few minutes later where we were actually going to an island. So we end up on a boat. And all of a sudden, the sun is shining, the water is sparkling beneath me, the wind is blowing through my hair, and all of a sudden I was happy. I didn't have to do any tricks. I didn't have to think about anything. I didn't have to remind myself to appreciate the world. I just felt good. And I thought, what just happened?
Mm.
And how do I make that happen again? And that is really very much the start. We think so often about all the things our bodies do wrong, right? You get a splinter, you are miserable. You have a cold, you don't want to get out of bed. And our bodies can make us miserable. But at that moment, it occurred to me, our bodies can also bring us joy. Our bodies can also make us happy. And the places we put ourselves, the things we see, the things we eat, the things we look at can make a huge difference. And so that was the fun for me in writing this book because it hasn't really been looked at that way before. So I interviewed, neurologists and psychologists and people from all different fields and pulled the research all together, plus lots of fun stories of my own.
Oh, and I love it. And when you've lived life, right, you have all those stories, but now you're looking at them with a different lens and you're saying, oh my gosh, wait, that moment was a moment that I was able to shift and it was because of my body. We don't give our bodies enough credit and we're not as kind to them as we probably should be either. And I think that those two things are most definitely related. But you said you interviewed a bunch of different people. I want to know the most fascinating and surprising interview that you had for this book. Like, was there a person or was there something that they said that kind of blew your mind?
Well, there was so many, but one of the ones that really fascinated me was one of the very first I did with a professor named John Barge out of Yale. And he had done a study where he invited people to come to his lab. And they were volunteers, usually students. And as they were coming up in the elevator, his assistant was with them, and she was holding a whole bunch of books and either a cup of warm coffee or a cup of iced coffee. And as she was fumbling with her books, she would ask the student volunteer, "Would you just hold my coffee for me for a minute?" And they held the coffee for her, and then they got off the elevator, went into the lab. They didn't know that that was part of the experiment. They thought that what the experiment was then they went into the lab and they met or various people were described to them, and they were asked their impressions of the people. Well, what happened was that the people who had been given the warm coffee to hold described the people as warmer and kinder than the people who had been given the iced coffee to hold. And that just completely blew me away.
Yeah.
How could that be? How could something as small as what you're holding, and not even holding at that moment, but what you're holding previously affect you? And it turns out that our brains are always taking that information from our body. And in a funny way, our brains think in metaphors. So, you're holding something warm, you respond a little bit more warmly. And that research has been repeated over and over again with both that same kind of warm, cold stuff and with other things, like there was research done by a professor now out of the University of Michigan who found that when people sit on hard chairs, they negotiate harder than when they sit on soft chairs. And again, the metaphor, soft chair, soft heart. And you can turn that around in so many different ways. I guess if you are negotiating, make sure you're sitting on a hard chair. If you're at home and you want to feel good or you want people to feel kind, throw some soft pillows around your house. and you're likely to feel a little bit better. So I can tell you one other quick piece of research that John Large did that fascinated me. He had people evaluate resumes. Now, that's a kind of standard psychological test to have people evaluate resumes. And if I gave you one of those resumes, Christy, you'd probably go, oh, I know they're looking for unconscious bias. So I'm going to make sure that I don't judge somebody differently because they're male or female or because of where they live or what they look like. What you might not think about is the weight of the clipboard that the resume is on. And Barge and his colleagues found that when people looked at resumes that were on a heavy clipboard, they judged the people as being more serious, more likely to succeed, than the people whose resumes were on a light clipboard. Again, somehow holding the clipboard made you feel like, oh, this is a heavyweight. And your brain took that information as well as the information that was actually on the resume.
Okay, I have a practical example of this exact thing that happened at dinner last night. So I host a family dinner every Sunday with my in-laws and my kids. My kids are grown, they're 23 and one is engaged. And so, we're growing as a family. My mom was there and my husband has two things that annoy him at mealtime. One is the weight of the fork, and the other is the weight of the plate. And we bought these plates at Target. We have our substantial china that my aunt gave us when we got married, actually when we were engaged 27 years ago. And they are substantial Port Marion, beautiful plates, right? But we've broken them over the years, so I don't have 8 of them, but I have 8 of the Target plates. And my husband said, why are we using the light plates? I don't like the light plates. I like the heavy plates. But it's got to be because it feels more like this is home. This is right. This is the way it's supposed to be. That is fascinating.
I love that. That's exactly right. And I'll tell you, just to tell you one similar story, which is that, and I tell the story in the book, I think, I had bought a new iPhone and after using it for a couple of days, I was really unhappy with it. I just missed my old phone. I didn't like anything about it. I went back to the store and I said, something's wrong with this phone. I don't know what it is. Unfortunately, the guy at the Genius Bar who was smart enough to say, I think it's the case you bought. I said, what? He said, yeah, I'm finding that people who bought that case, and it was just a clear plastic case. He said, but it was a hard plastic case with hard edges. And he said, I'm finding people who bought that case don't like the phone. Try this one. And he took off the case and he put on a very soft silicone phone cover. And it felt better. And I said, I think you're crazy, but okay, I'll try it. And I brought the bowl. And sure enough, by the end of the day, I was loving my new phone. Now, you would think my brain would be smart enough to be focused on the technology in my brilliant phone, but instead it was taking in, this feels hard. This feels unpleasant. I don't like the way this feels in my hand. And the very exact same technology, as soon as it was surrounded by a pretty soft silicone that felt good in my hand and sent a good message to my brain, all of a sudden, I thought it was a great phone.
It's like the itchy tag, right? Like if you're wearing a shirt that has an itchy tag or if something's pinching you incorrectly, then we're just miserable. How interesting. Okay, so what do we do about it? Well, you tell me. What do we do now that we know that something as simple as the type of case on your phone can send you into, I hate this thing, I don't want it. How do we convince our body and our brain to work together?
That's the great question. And I think the first thing is to just be aware of these body-mind links because we're not usually aware of them. And often when I tell people these things, they go, oh, yeah, no, I'm too smart for that to happen. And of course, those are the people who are most likely to get
100%.
caught by that. So be aware of what's happening and then be aware of little things that you can do. So when you're walking down the street and you're feeling grumpy and everything feels lousy, stop for a moment. And, in the old days, I would say stop and appreciate something. Now I'll say stop and stand a little straighter. Because if you stand up and stand or sit up straighter, the research shows that your brain feels more positive. And there was a researcher who I spoke to who did this experiment with me, and he told me to sit slouched over. And everybody who's listening could try this at some point. Sit slouched over and try to think of a negative memory. And one will pop into your head immediately. Then try to think of a positive memory, and it's going to be a lot harder. But if you sit up straight and you try to think of a positive memory, it's going to pop right into your head. And the reason is that when we're depressed, when we're unhappy, we naturally slouch. And so our body and mind makes that connection between being slouched and being unhappy and being straight and being positive. So if you start by making yourself sit up straight, stand up straight, you're just immediately going to feel more positive about what you do. It's like that old experiment where if you smile, even if it's a fake smile,
Mhm.
you're going to feel better.
Yeah.
And once again, you want to think, I'm sorry, my brain knows the difference between a fake smile and a real smile. Sorry, but it doesn't. It's your brain is constantly scanning your body for information. And when it sees, oh, face is an expression of a smile, we must be happy here. That's the information your brain takes in. So just those little things about how you hold your body, how you position yourself, smiling more or less, can make a big difference in the joy you feel every day.
Ah, that is it's so true. I'm literally in my mind thinking of all the different things that I've heard in the last week that fit this mold, right? Like, so my husband and I are marriage mentors, and we were talking to one of our couples, and she's been sick for like 5 weeks. She just can't kick this sinus thing. And they got into an argument on the way to mentoring, which typically happens, right? Because I think Satan doesn't like happy marriages, but that's just that's the way I look at it. So if you're working on your marriage, he's going to attack. But in this case, they got into an argument, and it was over something super silly, right? It's something that didn't make a lot of sense. And she realized it was because she didn't feel well. And she said, "I'm sorry, I'm being snippy for no good reason because I just don't feel well." So I guess I'm just saying, yes, you are so right. And this makes all the sense in the world. So I want to see if we can make some connections between what you've learned. Well, you've learned lots of things, right? And you know that gratitude matters, and you know that your body matters. And what I hear is we don't have, our sphere of control is teeny teeny tiny, right? Like, so if you're not watching, I'm looking through my fingers, little itty bitty, right? Our sphere of control, but our sphere of influence is unstoppable. So if you're standing up straighter, then you are influencing your brain to see good instead of bad. And I think there's just so much power in that. But I want to see if we can make a connection between what you're saying and productive joy. Like, how do you see those two things together? How do you see knowing your body and productive joy working together?
Well, let's take it from what you were just saying about marriages, right? So if you're aware of the physicality of a marriage, when you're tense with your spouse and you're lying in bed and you're both on opposite sides of the bed and you can just feel that tension between you. And if you try to talk, it's just going to get worse. I found sometimes I'll just reach over and take my husband's hand or touch him or touch his shoulder, and nobody can be angry at that point, right? It just sort of dissolves something. There's a real power in touch. And, I think one of the things we've lost in the workplace and the schools and other places is, this great fear we have of touch now for very good reasons. I understand that. But, there are times that maybe somebody still does need a hug. You need to ask them first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly understand that. And I don't mean that that should be the basis in the workplace, but just being aware of how people are feeling. And little things like flowers turn out to be very powerful. Researchers think that maybe we are just wired to respond powerfully to flowers back from the days when we were in the fields and we were self-sustaining. And when we saw flowers, it meant that berries and fruit was about to follow. And there was one wonderful study where people were sent, I believe it was a candle, flowers, or a fruit basket. And then their well-being was checked for the next hours and days afterwards. And the people who got the flowers, well-being was much higher. So maybe add some flowers to your workplace. It just makes people feel good. It just makes it have a sense that there's joy in the air and happiness around. And you don't even have to say anything about it. But if there are flowers around, people are going to respond to that and have a sense that maybe this is a happy place to be.
So I'm hearing you say that we can create productive joy. We just need to impact our environment, think, I don't want to say strategically, think consciously about how we're carrying ourselves and what we're surrounding ourselves with. And it will have such a huge impact. Janice, this is fascinating and so true, right? Like everything that you've said, I can fully see it, playing out in my own life. I'm also curious what advice you would give to leaders, knowing this about our physicality and the fact that we react to our environment. What can leaders do, whether they're remote or in an office, right? That's the other hard part is anymore, we're not physically together as often, just like we're not physically together right now. So how can leaders impact people's physical well-being, which will impact their mental well-being?
Well, I think if you are remote, it is important to realize that remote means remote and remote means
True.
distant. And and maybe there are times that you do need to call people together, that there is power in being together. And I'm certainly not going to advise anybody on how many days a week or a month that is meant to be, but just be aware of the power of having people connected. If you do have people in the workplace, be a little more aware of what their surroundings are like because some of the things that we have done with open offices, with noisy places, have just been so destructive to morale. And the things that we think were making people work better are just making people work so much more poorly. Noise is very destructive to our well-being. And so be aware of that. And it's not things that need to cost anymore necessarily. It's just being aware of how people function better and the environment that you can create that will allow that.
Did the research find that it's different for different people, right? Like, so the standing up straight, I would think would impact everyone similarly. But do some people respond to brighter rooms differently than darker rooms in a good or bad way? What did you find?
Well, the funny thing is that we all think that certain things don't affect us. And I just mentioned noise, and I found
Yeah.
that in particular with noise. I'm very sensitive to noise. It drives me crazy. And a place that I was working for a while, I'm in New York, as you mentioned, and there was construction going on outside. There was constant drilling. And I said to somebody who was often sitting next to me, I said, this is driving me crazy. And he said, oh, I don't even hear it
Mm.
anymore. And when I did the research, I found out that, well, maybe he thinks he didn't hear it anymore.
Ah,
His body is hearing it. You can close your eyes. We have eyelids. We don't have any way to close our ears. And so you can put on headphones, but that doesn't work if you're trying to talk to somebody. So,
right.
so that constant background noise that often happens or that often happens in offices is actually a sign of causes tension in our bodies, right? Our bodies have learned that if there's a loud noise, you better get on alert. It probably means something is wrong. So I think if we're aware of those things and try to adjust a little bit, even if we think it's not affecting us, to be aware that maybe it is.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right. I think once you remove some of those things, you go, "Oh gosh, we have a fan in our bathroom that makes me crazy." We turn it on when we're taking a shower. It is so loud that the moment my husband steps out of the shower, I'm like, "Oh, that's going off." Like that one gets to me. Others, I probably have just learned to ignore, but I think you're right. I think that we are impacted greatly by that kind of stuff for sure. So, going back to your chapter titles for a minute, I am an Apple Watch person and I am dying to know, and I know my audience will be too. What was tell us about that chapter?
Well, yes, we all love our Apple Watches and our Fitbits, but it turns out that constantly analyzing how many steps you're taking, which, by the way, I think we all know by now that most of the research is that 10,000 steps is completely meaningless. And
Right, right. It was an arbitrary number somebody just picked out of the sunny clear blue sky. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. But we still like to, know exactly how we're doing and exactly what we're doing. And a lot of the research now shows that if you're trying to be a professional athlete, that's a great idea. If you're trying to just exercise to feel better and to enjoy yourself, it's a terrible idea
Mhm.
because it takes you out of your body. It takes you out of the pleasure that you're having in the experience and makes it only an endpoint. And what you want when you're walking, when you're running, when you're swimming is to just indulge in that moment and to appreciate what you're doing and to enjoy it. And frankly, whether run 2 miles or 2.3 miles doesn't really matter. But in terms of your well-being, in terms of how you feel, if you're just enjoying that run and not constantly glancing at your watch, will feel better. And so that's a good reason to maybe you don't have to throw out your Apple Watch, Christy, but just put it aside once in a while.
Yes, just take it off. It does have an indentation on my arm. That's probably not a good thing, right? Like, well, and I have seen that in my own experiences too, when I'm just free and I'm like, oh, Yeah, that was actually kind of fun. Yes, I think you're right. I think that there are a lot of things like that that we don't even realize have had that impact on us over time, and we get stuck, right? I think that's true of anything. We get stuck. And what I'm hearing you say is that little tweaks could make a really big difference if we're taking care of our humanness, not just our minds, but our bodies. The two work very well hand in hand, don't they?
Right. And one other thing for leaders, as you asked, the Apple Watch made me think of it, is that there's a huge amount of research showing that creativity is linked to movement.
Mhm.
More creative when you're walking, when you're running, certainly when you're outside. And so when we're all sitting hunched over our computers and trying to come up with a good idea, that's probably about the last place that you're going to get it. So the offices that do allow people to wander around, maybe again, the remote, just the sense of being able to move, there seems to be huge connection between movement and coming up with creative thoughts. So you can do that for yourself and for others too.
So I teach people how to make learning stick, right? That's the name of my book. And I talk in there about things like walk and talks, how valuable it is to physically get up and move, whether it's an hour training or an all day training, doesn't matter. If we're in the same spot, our body files, our minds file things in one giant file folder. And if we move, it starts a new file folder, which is a whole lot easier to find when you're going back through your database and trying to actually pull the information out. So, yeah, you know what? You're making me feel like I'm not a crazy person because I do believe all of these things to be true. And I know for me, I feel better if I move first thing in the morning. I feel better if I am not just sitting at my desk. And it sounds to me like my body's just telling me, hey, that's not good for you. Let's go.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I used to find when I would be writing novels years ago, and I lived in the suburbs, and I would write in the morning, and then sometime around 1 or 2 o'clock, I would always feel like I needed to go out for a bike ride.
Mm.
And I think that what happens after you're writing for a while is you kind of get stuck on. I was writing mysteries and various other things, and you get stuck on a plot point. And without even realizing it, just going out and bicycling would free my mind again, and I would solve all the problems as I was bicycling, which I couldn't necessarily do at my computer. So, yeah, give yourself the chance to go outside.
Uh, Oh, I love that. Well, Janice, I know I could talk to you all day, but I know that you are a busy lady and you have other things to do today. So I have some rapid fire questions that I want to ask. But before I do, how would people find you? What's the best way for them to learn more about you, to get your book, to find all of your stuff?
Well, the book is What Your Body Knows About Happiness, and it's on Amazon. It should be at your local bookstore. It should be everywhere. And I hope people will get it because I think it's fun, it's interesting, and I think it'll open your mind to a lot of things. It's What Your Body Knows About Happiness. And I love to hear from people. My website is just janicekaplan.com. And come to the website. There's a place to contact me. Let me know what you think about the book. Let me know your stories. Let me know about the Target plates that are driving your husband crazy. Love that story.
Hey,
Good.
it's driving me nuts. I have to buy new ones now. Great. That's perfect. Okay, so now that we know how to find you, I've got some really fun questions. Well, I think they're fun that I know everybody is going to enjoy hearing your answers to. Are you ready?
I'll try.
Okay. I know trust me, there are no wrong answers. What, Janice, what is your definition of fun?
Oh boy. I like anything that's outside in nature. I just always feel happy when I'm outside, when I'm in the woods, when I'm at the ocean. So I just find it's much easier to have fun when you're outside.
I would agree. I was just going to ask you beach or mountains, but it sounds like you're both, which is totally okay too. Okay. How do you know that you're showing up as your authentic self?
I don't think there is an authentic self. I
Okay.
think we change according to the places we are and the people we're with. And the idea that, wherever you go, you take yourself with you, that's not true. When you're in a happy place, you feel happier and you respond differently. So I think that we can be authentic in many different ways in different circumstances.
Well, we're multifaceted humans, right? Like there's not one way we show up. I think that makes perfect sense. All right. How do you channel your best self on your worst days?
I do still try to do those gratitude exercises. When I'm feeling miserable, I sometimes physically make myself stop and think, Think of something positive. Think, turn this situation around. How would you describe what's happening right now in a positive way? And it's amazing. You always can do it. And I just find that that really does help.
It does. Well, and all the things that you've taught us about standing up a little straighter or buying some flowers or just changing our environment, I think would work too, right? Okay, last question. People by nature are going to hear all the things and get excited about all the things, but they're going to zero in on one. What's the one thing that you've talked about today that you really want people to leave with?
I think it's sort of the basis of the book, which is to remember that your brain is not the big computer controlling everything, that your body plays a huge part in your well being and your happiness. And to be aware of that and to use all of the advantages that we have, all of the physical advantages we have to improve our happiness and other people's happiness too.
Oh, you've given us so many great nuggets of wisdom today. And I'm just so honored that you picked productive joy, that this was a place that you saw a connection between what you're doing and what we're doing. Because ultimately, we're just trying to give leaders a shot of B12 and an opportunity to see things differently. And you did just that today. So, for all of you listening today, I hope that you'll remember things like walk and talks work and putting flowers in the office will have a better impact. Change the lighting, stand up straighter, do the things that your physical body can handle so that your mental state can follow. And thank you, Janice, for sharing your wisdom. I know you could have been doing a whole lot of other things, but you picked today to be with us. So, for my Productive Joy listeners, if you're not already following, now's the time. You can see that we've got some really brilliant people here sharing their joy. And I'm going to ask the same thing I ask of you every week, and that's that you figure out a way to turn fun into action.